A starving stray dog begs for food, but what happens next will break your heart. The city never stopped moving. It never cared who was left behind. The streets of New York pulsed with life, filled with the endless honking of impatient drivers and hurried footsteps of pedestrians rushing to their destinations. The sky was a dull gray, thick cloud rolling in like a warning of an impending storm. The wind howled through the towering buildings, slipping through the cracks of old apartments and swirling around street corners. It was the kind of cold that clung to your bones, the kind that made people pull their coats tighter and quicken their pace. No one wanted to be outside longer than they had to, but for one starving, forgotten dog, there was nowhere else to be. He stood on the icy pavement near a small bakery, his thin body trembling from more than just the cold. His fur, once golden and thick, was now matted and dirty, clinging to his frail frame. His ribs jutted out with every shaky breath he took, a silent testimony to the countless days he had spent without a proper meal. His eyes, large and sorrowful, told a story no words ever could. They were not just the eyes of a hungry stray, they were the eyes of an animal who had once belonged somewhere to someone. Eyes that had once been filled with trust and love, but were now clouded with loneliness and despair. The scent of warm bread and fresh pastries drifted through the crisp air, carrying with it an unbearable temptation. His stomach clenched painfully as he watched through the glass window of the bakery. Inside, customers sat at small wooden tables, laughing and chatting over steaming cups of coffee and plates of food they had barely taken a second thought to order. A half-eaten croissant lay abandoned on one of the tables. Crumbs littered the wooden surface. Just a few feet away, the dog sat motionless, his gaze locked on the tiny, insignificant crumbs, as if they were his last hope. He didn't whine. He didn't bark. He didn't beg. He simply waited. Maybe someone would notice him. Maybe someone would care. A man in a long coat pushed open the bakery door, a small paper bag tucked under his arm. As he stepped outside, the dog instinctively took a cautious step forward, his tail low, his movements hesitant. His body language was clear. He had learned not to expect kindness, but a part of him still hoped. The man's gaze flickered toward him for a brief moment. He hesitated. For a split second, it looked as if he might do something, reach into his bag, maybe toss a small piece of bread onto the sidewalk. But then, just as quickly, he sighed, shook his head, and kept walking. The dog didn't follow him. He had been through this before. Another woman emerged from the bakery, juggling a bagel in one hand and a coffee cup in the other, her scarf wrapped tightly around her neck. She stepped past the stray as if he were no more than a forgotten piece of the city, a crack in the pavement, a shadow against the wall. The world moved around him, relentless and uncaring. A gust of wind sent a discarded newspaper fluttering across the sidewalk, skimming past his paws. He barely flinched. The cold was biting now, seeping into his bones. He curled his tail around himself, tucking his nose close in a feeble attempt to keep warm. It had been days, maybe weeks, since he had last known the comfort of a home. Did he even remember what home felt like? The streets had been his world for so long. Each night he had curled up in alleyways, beneath park benches, or in the hidden corners of abandoned buildings, trying to disappear into the darkness. He had learned to dodge cars, to avoid the cruel hands of those who saw him as nothing more than a nuisance. And yet, despite it all, he still waited outside that bakery. Because something deep inside him refused to give up. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was hope. Or maybe he just couldn't let go of the feeling that once, a long time ago, someone had loved him. Then, through the warm glow of the bakery's window, someone did notice him. A pair of eyes met him through the glass, soft, curious, filled with something he had not seen in a long time. Compassion. And for the first time in what felt like forever, the stray dog's lonely wait was about to change. Maria had owned Bella's bakery for nearly 10 years, and in that time, she had seen plenty of stray dogs wander the streets. Most of them were rough, scavenging through trash, barking at pedestrians, or darting through traffic in search of scraps. But this dog, this one was different. He didn't whimper, didn't pace anxiously or beg for food like the others she had seen before. He just sat there outside the glass window, still and silent, watching. His body trembled from the cold, yet there was a strange dignity in the way he carried himself, as if he refused to let the world see his suffering. Maria had noticed him over the past few days, always at a distance, never coming too close. But today, as she arranged a fresh batch of croissants on display, she caught his eyes through the window. Big, dark, and hauntingly sad. She wiped her flour-dusted hands on her apron and took a deep breath. Outside, the wind was bitter, carrying the scent of snow in the air. As Maria stepped out, the dog's ears twitched. He immediately lowered his head, shrinking into himself as if he expected to be shooed away like an unwanted pest. Maria's heart clenched at the sight. She knelt down slowly, careful not to startle him. "Hey, buddy," she said gently, her voice warm against the cold. "You hungry?" The dog didn't move at first. He just stared at her, wary and uncertain, as if he couldn't believe someone was actually speaking to him. Maria reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small piece of bread. She broke it in half and placed one piece on the ground, a few feet away from him. Still, the dog didn't move. His ribs were sharp beneath his golden fur, his body so frail that Maria wondered how he had survived the past few nights of freezing temperatures. But even in his desperate state, he hesitated. "He doesn't trust me." Maria didn't blame him. She remained still, patient, letting him decide whether to come closer. Seconds stretched painfully long before he finally took a cautious step forward. His nose twitched, sniffing the air, and then he took another step. He was close enough now that Maria could see the deep brown of his eyes, eyes that held a story she could only guess at. Slowly, he lowered his head and sniffed the bread. Then, with the gentleness of a creature who had learned to survive without being noticed, he picked it up and swallowed it whole. Maria let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't invisible. She watched him closely, taking in every detail. The way his tail remained low, the cautious way he chewed, as if afraid someone would take the food away. "What happened to you, boy?" She wanted to reach out to let him know he was safe. Slowly, she extended her hand. The dog tensed. Before her fingers could touch him, he flinched and took a step back. His ears flattened against his head, his eyes darting around as if expecting a blow. Maria froze. That reaction told her everything. He had been hurt before. Maybe by a stranger. Maybe by an owner he had once trusted. Whatever had happened to him, it had left him afraid of kindness. Maria swallowed hard. She wanted to tell him that she wasn't like whoever had hurt him, that he didn't need to be scared anymore. But words wouldn't mean anything to a dog who had only known cruelty. So instead, she simply sat there, letting him decide what to do next. The dog didn't run, but he didn't come closer either. He just stood there staring at her, caught between hunger and fear. Maria sighed. "All right," she whispered. "I'll see you tomorrow then." She rose to her feet, brushing the cold from her knees. For a moment she hesitated, wondering if she should try again, offer more food, try to get him to follow her inside. But something told her to be patient. So she turned and went back into the bakery, the warmth of the kitchen hitting her like a comforting embrace. But even as she returned to her work, kneading dough and taking orders, her mind kept drifting back to the lonely stray outside. She found herself glancing out the window more times than she cared to admit, hoping he hadn't disappeared. But after a while, when she looked again, he was gone. Maria stood there, staring at the empty sidewalk. The breadcrumbs she had left were still there, untouched. She exhaled, pressing a hand to her chest. Would he come back tomorrow? She didn't know, but something deep inside her hoped he would. The next morning, Maria found herself scanning the street before she even opened the bakery. Would he come back? She wasn't sure why she felt so anxious. Maybe it was the way he had looked at her the night before, cautious but hopeful, as if he was trying to decide whether or not to trust her. Maybe it was the way he had disappeared into the night, leaving only his quiet presence lingering in her mind. Then Just as she was about to step inside, she saw him. The dog was there again, huddled near the same spot. His thin body trembled against the biting morning air, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. But this time something was different. This time, when he saw Maria, he didn't flinch. A soft smile tugged at her lips. She knelt down, placing a small bowl of water and a fresh piece of bread in front of him. He hesitated for just a moment before inching closer, sniffing the bread cautiously. Then, as if hunger had finally won over fear, he ate, not as frantically as before, but with a quiet urgency, like he finally believed the food wouldn't be taken from him. Maria watched him, her heart aching at how thin he was. The way his ribs pressed against his dirty, tangled fur made her stomach twist. She didn't want to think about how many nights he had spent out in the cold, how many times he had been ignored, how many people had passed him by without a second glance. Day after day he returned, and little by little Maria earned his trust. At first he kept his distance. He would eat whatever she left for him, but wouldn't let her come too close. Then slowly things began to change. One morning, as she set down his food, he stayed. He didn't take it and run like before. Instead, he sat near her, his tired eyes watching her hands as if waiting for her next move. Maria, careful not to scare him, spoke to him in soft whispers. She told him about her day, about the customers who came into the bakery, about the weather. She didn't know if he understood, but he listened. And then one evening, as the sun dipped behind the buildings and the bakery lights glowed against the darkening sky, it happened. For the first time, he let her touch him. Maria had reached out as she always did, expecting him to pull away. But this time he didn't move. Her fingers brushed against his tangled fur, feeling the roughness of dirt and neglect. Slowly, she ran her hand along his back, her touch feather-light, afraid that if she pressed too hard, he would vanish like a ghost. But he didn't. Instead, he let out a breath, a deep, shaky exhale, as if he had been holding it in for years. Maria smiled. Good boy. It was a small moment, but it felt like a breakthrough. Then, as she gently ran her hand over his neck, she felt it, something thin and rough beneath his fur. Her fingers brushed against it again, and her stomach dropped. A collar, or at least what was left of one. She carefully moved his fur aside, revealing a worn, tattered strip of fabric wrapped loosely around his neck. There was no tag, no sign of who he had once belonged to, but there was something else, something that made Maria's breath catch in her throat. A scar, a thin, deep mark circling his neck, as if at one point something had been pulled too tight, cutting into his skin. Maria swallowed, her chest tightening. This dog had belonged to someone. A million questions raced through her mind. Had he been lost? Had someone been looking for him? Or worse, had someone thrown him away? She didn't want to believe it, but the scar told her everything. Someone had once put a leash around his neck. Someone had once called him theirs. And now he was here, shivering in the cold, starving, abandoned. Maria felt a lump form in her throat. She looked at the dog, really looked at him. What had happened to him before he ended up alone? Determined to find out, she pulled out her phone. With careful movements, she snapped a photo of him, capturing the sadness in his deep brown eyes, the frailness of his body. Then she typed a simple message. Does anyone recognize this dog? He's been on the streets for a long time. Please, let me know if you have any information. She posted it online, hoping, praying that someone somewhere knew his story. Hours passed. The bakery filled and emptied. Customers came and went. Maria checked her phone too many times to count, no responses. Then, just as she was about to give up, a notification popped up. A comment. I think this was my neighbor's dog years ago. He just disappeared one day. Maria's breath caught. Her heart pounded as she reread the words over and over. This wasn't just a stray. He had a past. And now Maria was going to find out what happened to him. Maria stood at the bakery door, watching the dog curled up on the cold pavement, He had become a familiar sight now, showing up every morning, waiting patiently for the scraps she left him. But tonight was different. The wind had turned sharp, cutting through the city, like a blade. Snowflakes began to fall, clinging to his already damp fur, making him shiver. The forecast had warned of a deadly drop in temperature, the kind that turned the streets into frozen graveyards for those unlucky enough to be left outside. Maria couldn't let that happen. She wiped her hands on her apron, hesitated for just a moment, then stepped outside. The dog lifted his head at the sound of her boots on the pavement. His eyes met hers, dark, weary, but still holding a quiet hope. "Come inside, buddy," she said, her voice soft but firm. She pushed the door open, letting the warmth from inside spill out into the cold. The dog hesitated. He had never been welcomed anywhere before. For a moment, Maria thought he would turn and run, the way he always had when people got too close. But something in her voice, something gentle, unwavering, made him reconsider. Slowly, cautiously, he took a step forward, then another, and finally, he crossed the threshold. Maria shut the door behind him. The bakery's warmth was a stark contrast to the freezing air outside. The dog stood in the middle of the room, his body tense, his paws hesitantly pressing into the wooden floor, as if unsure if he was truly allowed to be there. Maria crouched down, holding out her hand. "You're safe," she whispered. The dog didn't move for a long moment. Then, almost imperceptibly, he exhaled, a slow, deep breath as if he had been holding it in for far too long. That night, she gave him food, fresh water, and a soft blanket in the corner of the bakery. He ate in silence, his tail still tucked low, his eyes darting toward her every few seconds, as if expecting this kindness to be temporary, as if expecting to be thrown back out into the cold. But Maria had already made up her mind. She wasn't sending him away. She named him Lucky, because despite everything, despite the suffering, despite the scars, he had survived. At first, Lucky barely moved from his corner. He ate when Maria left food but flinched if she got too close. He slept curled tightly, as if protecting himself from something unseen. But little by little, things began to change. One morning, Maria found him lying near the counter, instead of his usual spot in the corner. A small step, but progress nonetheless. A few days later, as she set a bowl of food down, his tail gave the tiniest of wags. And then, one evening, while she was reading on the couch, Lucky walked over, circled once, and laid down at her feet. Maria didn't move. She didn't dare break the moment. She only let out a small, grateful breath. Lucky was beginning to trust her, and for the first time in what must have been years, he wasn't just surviving. He was home. The afternoon was crisp and bright, a rare break from the winter chill. Maria decided to take Lucky for a walk, something she had been introducing. Slowly. He was still nervous around people, still flinched at sudden sounds, but he was learning. And for the first time, he was learning with her. She held onto his leash loosely, letting him set the pace as they wandered through the quieter streets. Lucky seemed relaxed, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. It was one of the few times Maria had seen him calm, at peace. Then suddenly, Lucky stopped. His body tensed, ears perked, tail rigid. Maria barely had time to react before he took off running. The leash yanked hard against her fingers, slipping from her grasp before she could tighten her hold. "Lucky!" she shouted. But he was gone. Her heart pounded as she ran after him, dodging pedestrians, her breath coming in sharp gasps. Lucky moved with purpose, darting down streets as if following a scent no one else could sense. Maria turned a corner and froze. Lucky stood in the middle of the sidewalk staring at someone, an old man. He was thin, his coat a little too big for his frame, his hands trembling at his sides. His face was lined with age, with loss, with something Maria couldn't quite place. But his eyes were wet with tears. The man took a slow, shaky step forward, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Max?" Lucky didn't move at first, then slowly he took a step forward. Maria's stomach twisted. Max. She looked at Lucky. His body language, the way he held himself, the way his tail flickered uncertainty, the way he stared at this stranger with something between recognition and hesitation. This wasn't just a coincidence. This was something deeper, something Maria wasn't prepared for. Who was this man? And more importantly, who was Lucky before he became hers? Maria's breath caught in her throat as she watched the old man collapse onto his knees, his frail hands trembling as he reached out toward Lucky. His eyes, rimmed with unshed tears, locked onto the dog in front of him, desperate and searching, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. Lucky stood frozen, his body tense with uncertainty. His ears flicked back, his head tilting slightly, as he took a hesitant step forward. He let out a soft whimper, not of fear but of recognition. Maria felt the weight of reality settle deep in her chest. This wasn't just a coincidence. This wasn't just some old man who happened to know Lucky. This was his owner. She looked back at the man, his face lined with age and grief. His hands shook, his breath coming in uneven gasps, as if the sight of the dog before him had shattered something inside him, something he had tried for years to hold together. Max. The name had left his lips in a whisper, so soft that Maria had almost missed it. Lucky. Max took another step forward, his tail wagging slightly, uncertain but hopeful. The old man's lips trembled as he tried to form words. Max, it's you, isn't it? His voice cracked, breaking under the weight of emotion. He swallowed hard, looking up at Maria with tear-filled eyes. I lost him, he whispered, shaking his head. I lost him so many years ago. Maria's heart clenched. What happened? She asked softly. The old man, Mr. Howard, dragged in a shaky breath. I got sick. His gaze never left Lucky, as if he was afraid that if he looked away, the dog would vanish like a fading memory. I was taken to the hospital. My family. He exhaled, the grief evident in his voice. They didn't think I would recover. They thought he was a burden, so they gave him away, and by the time I got better, he swallowed the lump in his throat. He was gone. A heavy silence settled between them, broken only by the distant hum of the city. Maria felt her own throat tighten. She looked down at Lucky, whose deep brown eyes flickered between her and the man in front of him. All this time, she had thought she was saving him, giving him a home, giving him warmth, giving him a chance at something better. But the truth was clear now. Lucky had been searching for someone else, for the man who had never stopped looking for him. Tears burned at the back of Maria's eyes. She had spent weeks with this dog, had nurtured him back to health, had watched him slowly learn to trust again. She had watched the way he had started wagging his tail, the way he had started sleeping peacefully, instead of curling up as if preparing for the worst. She had given him a home. But she had never been his home, not in the way Mr. Howard was. Her chest tightened as she realized what she had to do. She had a choice. She could keep him. She could hold on to him, tell herself that he was hers now, that the bond they had built was enough. Or she could do what was right. She could let him go. Maria swallowed hard. Her fingers trembled as she reached down and unclipped the leash from his collar. Lucky turned to look at her, his eyes full of something deep, something unspoken. She forced a small smile through her tears. Go on, boy. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Lucky hesitated. For a moment, Maria thought he wouldn't leave, that maybe, despite everything, he would choose to stay with her. But then, his tail wagged ever so slightly. He took a step toward Mr. Howard, then another. And then finally, he trotted into the arms of the man who had never stopped loving him. Mr. Howard let out a choked sob as he wrapped his arms around his long-lost companion. Lucky buried his face into the man's coat, nuzzling him, whimpering softly, as if to say, I missed you too. Maria pressed a hand to her chest, her heart aching yet full. She had lost him. But somehow she had also given him back what he had been looking for all along. And for that she would never regret letting go. The streets were quieter than usual that night. The city still pulsed with its usual rhythm, distant sirens, the hum of passing cars, the occasional murmur of late-night conversations, but for Maria, everything felt still. She walked home alone, the empty leash wrapped loosely around her fingers. Her steps were slow, her heart heavy yet full. Lucky was gone, or rather, he was where he had always belonged. She had watched him disappear into Mr. Howard's arms, had seen the way his body relaxed in the embrace of the man who had never stopped looking for him. She had seen recognition dawn in his eyes, not just as familiarity, but as something deeper, something whole. Lucky had been lost, but now he was home. And yet, as she unlocked her apartment door and stepped inside, the silence felt different. The space that had once been filled with the quiet padding of paws, the soft breaths of a sleeping dog at her feet, now felt emptier. She placed the leash on the kitchen counter, staring at it for a long moment. She had told herself she wouldn't, that she had made the right choice. But as she curled up on her couch, pulling the blanket tightly around herself, she felt the first tear slip down her cheek. For weeks, Lucky had been a part of her life. He had waited outside her bakery, watched her with those deep, searching eyes, learned to trust her in ways that had taken time and patience. And now, the little corner of her world where he had once belonged was quiet again. But this time, it wasn't empty. Because somewhere out there, he was loved, and that was all that mattered. The next morning, Maria opened the bakery as usual, but something felt different. She found herself glancing toward the door, half expecting to see Lucky waiting in his usual spot, his tail wagging slightly as she stepped outside. But he wasn't there, and he wouldn't be again. She took a deep breath, brushing the thought aside. It was a busy morning. Customers were already lining up, the scent of fresh bread and coffee filling the air. She could do this. She could move on. But just as she was about to step inside, something caught her eye. A small wooden box sat on the doorstep. Maria's heart skipped a beat. She bent down, carefully picking it up. There was no name, no indication of who had left it, just a simple folded note placed neatly on top. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Thank you for taking care of him when I couldn't. You saved his life. And mine. Mr. Howard. Maria felt her throat tighten. Inside the box, nestled carefully between folds of soft cloth, was an old photograph. She pulled it out, her breath catching as she took in the image. It was Lucky, Max. Years younger, his fur golden and full, his eyes bright with joy as he sat beside a much younger Mr. Howard. The man's arm was wrapped around him, both of them smiling, as if the world had never been anything but kind. Maria traced a finger over the worn edges of the photo. She could see it now, the life he had once had, the love he had once known. She had always wondered if Lucky had belonged to someone before the streets became his home. Now, she had her answer. He hadn't just been a stray. He had been loved. And when he had lost that love, when he had wandered alone through the city for years, when he had curled up outside a bakery, waiting for something, he had found his way back. Tears welled in Maria's eyes, but this time she smiled through them. She had lost him, but she had given him something priceless, a second chance at love. And in return, he had given her something too, a reminder that love, no matter how lost, always finds its way home.